The church was empty. Not a single soul sat in the polished pews. Not a whisper broke the heavy silence. Just the echo of a man's breath as he stood alone at the altar, his hands trembling around a diamond ring worth more than most people's lives. The stained glass windows cast fractured colors over his tailored suit, but even gold and silk couldn't hide the truth. No one came. Not his business partners, not his so-called friends, not even the bride's family. The doors remained shut, the aisle a void, and the millionaire's face twisted in humiliation as the seconds ticked by like a countdown to his public ruin. Then, a creak. The massive oak doors groaned open, and the faintest sliver of light cut through the gloom. A man stood there, his clothes worn thin, his shoes scuffed from years of hard labor. But it wasn't just him. In his arms, he cradled a little girl, her face pale, her tiny fingers clutching a folded piece of paper. The millionaire's breath caught. Who were they? Why would they dare crash his wedding, the wedding no one else wanted to attend? The man's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. There was no anger there, no triumph, just a quiet, devastating sorrow. He took a step forward, then another, the girl's weak cough echoing in the hollow space. The millionaire's pulse pounded in his ears. What did they want? Money? Revenge? Or something far worse, the truth? The girl lifted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daddy said you'd be alone today." The words hung in the air, heavy as a verdict. The millionaire's stomach twisted. What did she know? What had her father told her about him? And why, out of everyone in the world, had they shown up when no one else would? The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a single yellowed photograph. The millionaire's blood ran cold. He recognized that face. The past he'd buried was standing right in front of him, and in that moment he understood. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a reckoning. Hit like, if this opening shocked you, and subscribe for the full story. You won't believe what happens when the father speaks. The millionaire's name was Daniel Harroway, and the weight of his loneliness had never felt heavier than in that empty church. The air smelled of polished wood and old hymnals, but beneath it all was the sharp metallic tang of failure. He had spent months planning this wedding, a grand affair meant to solidify his empire, to prove to the world that he was untouchable. The guest list had been exclusive, the invitations engraved in gold, the venue chosen for its grandeur. But the pews yawned empty, the silence mocking him like a chorus of ghosts. No one came. Not the CEOs who laughed at his jokes over whiskey, not the politicians who shook his hand in public, not even the woman he was supposed to marry. A woman who had texted him just that morning. "I'll see you at the altar." Her words as cold and calculated as the prenuptial agreement she'd demanded. Daniel's fingers tightened around the ring in his pocket. It was a flawless diamond, just like everything else he owned. Perfect, expensive, and utterly meaningless. He had built his fortune on ruthlessness, on the kind of decisions that left others broken while he walked away richer. He had fired employees with a signature, shut down factories with a phone call, and crushed competitors without a second thought. But now, standing in that vast hollow church, he realized something terrifying. He had no one. Not a single person in the world cared enough to show up. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the stained glass windows. Daniel barely heard it. His mind was a storm of memories, boardroom victories, lavish parties, the way his assistants flinched when he raised his voice. He had always believed power was measured in silence, in the way people stepped aside when he walked into a room. But this silence, this was different. This was the silence of abandonment. Then the doors creaked open. Daniel's head snapped up. His first thought was relief. Someone had come. His second was confusion. The man standing in the doorway wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a designer suit. His clothes were faded, his shoes scuffed, his hands rough from manual labor. He carried a child, a little girl no older than 7, her dark hair tangled, her cheeks too pale. She clutched a piece of paper like it was a lifeline. The man's gaze met Daniel's, and in that moment, Daniel knew. This wasn't a guest. This was something else entirely. The man took a step forward, then another, his boots scuffing against the marble floor. The girl's eyes were wide, fixed on Daniel as if he were a ghost. "You're him," she whispered, her voice fragile. "The man from the pictures." Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't recognize her, but there was something in the way she looked at him, something that made his skin prickle. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. The man didn't flinch. He adjusted his hold on the girl, his expression unreadable. "You don't remember me, do you?" His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that had spent too many years shouting over machinery. "I worked for you. 10 years at Harroway Industries. I ran the assembly line in the Detroit plant." Daniel's mind raced. He had shut down that plant 2 years ago, laid off hundreds of workers with a single memo. No severance, no warning, just a cold corporate decision to maximize profits. The man's name came back to him then. Marcus Reyes. A foreman. A good one, if Daniel recalled correctly. The kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, never complained. The kind of man Daniel had fired without a second thought. "You shut us down," Marcus said, his voice steady. "No notice, no severance, just a letter saying the plant was closing and we were out of jobs." The girl shifted in his arms, coughing weakly. Daniel's eyes flicked to her. She was too thin, her skin sallow. "She's sick," Marcus continued, following his gaze. "Leukemia. We lost our insurance when you closed the plant. The treatments—" He trailed off, but the accusation hung in the air. "You did this." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had seen the numbers, signed the orders, moved on. He had never thought about the faces behind the layoffs. Never imagined a child, this child, paying the price. The girl reached out, her small hand trembling as she held out the folded paper. "My daddy said you needed to see this." Daniel hesitated, then took it. His fingers brushed against hers, and she was so cold. He unfolded the paper slowly, his breath catching as he recognized his own letterhead. It was a list of names, dozens of them, his employees, his former friends, the people who had built his empire, and scrawled next to each name in shaky handwriting were words like betrayed, abandoned, never again. At the bottom, a single sentence, "We didn't come because you don't deserve us." Daniel's hands shook. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about everything. Every decision, every cut corner, every life he'd ruined in the name of profit. The church seemed to spin around him. He had spent his life believing money could buy anything, loyalty, respect, even love. But it couldn't buy this. It couldn't buy the trust of a man he'd fired, the health of a child he'd indirectly harmed, the presence of people who had once believed in him. Marcus took another step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever wonder why no one showed up today, Mr. Harroway?" Daniel couldn't speak. The weight of the paper in his hands felt like a stone. "It's not just because of what you did to us. It's because of who you are." The girl coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that made Daniel's chest ache. "She asked me this morning why you were getting married if no one liked you." The words were a knife twist. I didn't have an answer. Daniel looked at the little girl, her eyes huge and sad. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he hadn't in years. Shame. Not the fleeting guilt of a bad business deal, but a deep, crushing shame that settled in his bones. He had spent his life chasing power, only to end up here, alone, exposed, with nothing but the echoes of his own cruelty to keep him company. Marcus reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a photograph. It was old, the edges worn. A younger Daniel stood in the center, surrounded by smiling workers, the Detroit plant, back when it was still running. Marcus was there too, his arm around a woman Daniel didn't recognize. His wife, probably. The girl's mother. "She died last year," Marcus said quietly. "Stress, the doctor said, after we lost everything." Daniel's vision blurred. He had done that. Not directly, not with his own hands, but with a signature, a decision, a lack of empathy. The girl squirmed in Marcus's arms, her breath shallow. "Daddy, I'm tired." Marcus pressed his lips to her forehead. "I know, baby. Just a little longer." Then he looked at Daniel, his eyes burning with something raw and unfiltered. "You have a choice, Mr. Harroway. You can keep living like this, alone, hated, with all the money in the world and no one to share it with." He gestured to the empty church. "Or you can change." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? "I'm sorry" wouldn't bring back the jobs, the health insurance the wife Marcus had lost. It wouldn't fill the pews or erase the past. The girl reached out suddenly, her tiny hand grabbing Daniel's sleeve. "My daddy says everyone deserves a second chance," she whispered. "Even you." Daniel stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack. He had spent his life believing he was above everyone else. But in that moment, he realized the truth. He was just a man, a broken one. And for the first time, he needed to be better. But how? Where did he even begin? The photograph trembled in his grip, the faces of the people he'd betrayed staring back at him. The church was still silent, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with ghosts. And Daniel Harroway was finally forced to see them. The girl's fingers were ice cold as they brushed against Daniel's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus said, his voice low, almost amused, but there was no humor in his eyes. Only exhaustion, only the weight of years spent carrying more than any man should have to. Daniel's breath hitched as he stared at the photograph still clutched in his hand, the faces of the people he'd discarded like used-up assets. The Detroit plant, the layoffs, the lives unraveled. It was all there, in the faded ink and creased edges, a testament to the wreckage he'd left behind. The girl coughed again, a sound that seemed to echo in the hollow church, and Daniel's chest tightened. "She needs a doctor," he said abruptly, his voice rough. Marcus's jaw clenched. "We can't afford one. Not since you shut down the plant. Not since you took away our insurance." The words weren't an accusation. They were a statement, a fact, and it cut deeper than any insult ever could. Daniel's mind raced. He could write a check right now, throw money at the problem like he always did. But something told him that wouldn't be enough. Not this time. Not for them. The girl's eyes were fixed on him, wide and unblinking, as if she could see straight through him. Through the tailored suit, the polished shoes, the carefully constructed facade of a man who had everything. "What's your name?" he asked her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lila," she said. "Lila Reyes." She said it like it was something precious, something she was proud of, even as her small body trembled in her father's arms. Daniel swallowed hard. "Lila," he repeated. The name settled in his chest like a stone. "You're sick." It wasn't a question, it was a realization. A child. This child was suffering because of him. Marcus shifted Lila's weight, his arms straining. "Leukemia. Stage 4. The treatments were working, but we couldn't keep up with the bills after—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel already knew. After he destroyed their lives. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He had signed the orders. He had made the calls. He had known people would suffer, but he'd told himself it was necessary. Business is business. But standing there, looking into Lila's sunken eyes, he understood the truth. He had been wrong. So wrong it made his bones ache. Lila reached into the pocket of her thin sweater and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "My teacher said if I ever wanted to tell someone how I felt, I should write it down." Daniel took the paper, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, but the words were clear. "Dear Mr. Harroway, I don't know you, but my daddy says you're the reason we don't have a home anymore. He says you're the reason my mommy cried so much before she went to heaven. I don't know if that's true, but I know I'm scared. I'm scared of the hospital. I'm scared of the dark. I'm scared my daddy won't be able to take care of me. But my daddy also says that people can change. He says even the bad ones. I don't know if you're bad, but I hope you're not. Because if you're not, maybe you can help us. Maybe you can help the other people too. Lila Reyes." Daniel's vision blurred. He had received thousands of letters in his life. Contracts, threats, flattery. But none had ever gutted him like this. A 7-year-old girl, fighting for her life, and all she wanted was hope. All she wanted was for him to not be the monster she'd been told he was. He looked up, his throat tight. "Marcus." "No." Marcus cut him off, his voice sharp. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. Not yet." He took a step closer, his eyes burning. "Words don't mean anything, Harroway. Not from you, not after everything." He gestured to the empty church, the abandoned altar, the ring still clutched in Daniel's hand. "You think this is about money? It's not. It's about you. It's about the man you've become. The man who would let a child suffer because it was convenient." Daniel flinched. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Inside are the names of every person you fired from the Detroit plant, every family you left without a future." He pressed it into Daniel's hands. "I want you to see them, not as numbers, not as line items on a spreadsheet, as people." He took a breath, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And then I want you to fix what you broke." Daniel's fingers tightened around the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Heavier than gold. Heavier than guilt. "How?" he asked, the word raw. "Start with her," Marcus said, nodding toward Lila. "Get her the treatment she needs. Then go to the others. Apologize. Really apologize. Not with money. With action." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And then, you change. You build something that doesn't destroy people, or you don't. But if you don't, you'll always be standing in an empty church wondering why no one stayed." Daniel's heart pounded. He had spent his life believing he was above reproach, that his success justified his cruelty. But now, faced with the fragile, hopeful eyes of a dying child, he understood the cost of that belief. "I'll do it," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I'll pay for her treatments, all of them, and I'll fix what I can." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." He turned to leave, but Lila reached out, her small hand catching Daniel's sleeve again. "Will you visit me?" she asked, her voice small. "At the hospital?" Daniel's chest ached. "Yes," he said, the word thick with promise. "I will." Marcus carried Lila toward the doors, her head resting against his shoulder. Just before they stepped into the sunlight, Marcus turned back, his expression unreadable. "One more thing, Harroway." He reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the floor at Daniel's feet. A small, tarnished medallion, the chain broken. "My wife's. She wore it every day. Said it was her good luck charm." His voice cracked. "She was holding it when she died. I want you to keep it, as a reminder." Daniel picked it up, the metal warm from Marcus's pocket. Engraved on the back were the words, "Love is the only thing that lasts." The doors closed behind them, leaving Daniel alone again. But this time the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of ghosts. Full of regret. Full of the crushing weight of what he had to do. He looked down at the envelope in his hands, then at the medallion, then at the ring he'd been about to place on a woman who didn't love him. His life had been built on lies, on the illusion of power, on the belief that he could buy his way out of anything. But not this. He took a deep breath, then walked toward the altar. The wedding was over. The real work was just beginning. What would you do if you were Daniel? Can a man like him ever truly change, or is some damage too deep to undo? The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair, a sharp, sterile scent that made Daniel's stomach clench as he stepped through the automatic doors. He had been here before, cutting ribbons at new wings, posing for photos with oversized checks, his name emblazoned on plaques as a generous benefactor. But he had never walked these halls as a man who understood what it meant to need them. Not until now. Lila was in room 307. The number glared at him from the door like an accusation. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. What was he supposed to say? "I'm sorry," felt too small. "I'll fix this" felt like a lie. He had spent his life commanding rooms, bending people to his will with a single look. But this This was different. This was a child. A father who hated him. A past he couldn't outrun. He pushed the door open. Marcus was sitting beside Lila's bed, holding her hand. She was propped up on pillows, her dark hair spread across the white sheets, her face pale but her eyes bright as they locked onto Daniel. "You came," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Marcus's gaze flicked up, his expression unreadable. "So did the devil," he muttered under his breath, but there was no real venom in it. Just exhaustion. Daniel stepped forward, the medallion heavy in his pocket. "I brought the paperwork," he said, his voice rough. "The treatments are covered, all of them. No limits." He set a folder on the table beside the bed. Inside were the signed documents, the transfers, the promises in black and white. Marcus didn't reach for it. "Money doesn't fix everything," he said, his voice low. "I know," Daniel replied, and for the first time, he did know. He pulled out the medallion and placed it on the bedside table. "I also brought this back. I don't have the right to keep it." Marcus's eyes flicked to the medallion, then back to Daniel. Something shifted in his expression, something raw, something broken. "You kept it," he said quietly. "That's more than I expected." Lila reached out, her fingers brushing against the medallion. "My mommy loved this," she whispered. "She said it was magic." Daniel's throat tightened. "It's not magic," he said. "It's just love." The word felt foreign on his tongue. He had spent his life chasing power, control, dominance. Love had never been part of the equation. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why are you here, Harroway? Really?" Daniel didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense anyway. "Because I had to be," he said finally. "Because for the first time in my life, I looked at something and knew I was wrong." He glanced at Lila, her small frame swallowed by the hospital bed, the IV tube snaking into her arm. "And because I don't want to be that man anymore." Marcus let out a slow breath. "People don't change overnight." "No," Daniel agreed. "But they can start." A nurse stepped into the room, her smile warm as she checked Lila's vitals. "Her counts are looking better," she said, glancing at the charts. "The new treatment is working." Daniel felt something unfurl in his chest, something like relief, something like hope. It was a foreign sensation, one he wasn't sure he deserved. Lila's eyes were drooping, the medication pulling her toward sleep. "Stay," she murmured, her hand reaching for Daniel's. He hesitated, then took it, her fingers small and fragile in his. "I'll stay," he promised. Marcus watched them, his expression unreadable. "You're going to break her heart," he said quietly, "if you walk away again." Daniel met his gaze. "I'm not walking away." The next morning, Daniel stood in front of the Detroit plant, or what was left of it. The building was a skeleton, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. Harroway's grave, someone had spray-painted across the entrance. He had driven here after leaving the hospital, the envelope Marcus had given him burning a hole in his pocket. Inside were the names. Dozens of them. People he had fired, lives he had disrupted, futures he had stolen. He had spent years convincing himself that progress required sacrifice, that success demanded ruthlessness. But standing there, in the ruins of what he had built, he understood the truth. He had been the sacrifice. He had traded his humanity for power, and it had left him hollow. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. "The board is asking about the wedding. The press is calling. What should I tell them?" Daniel stared at the screen, then deleted the message. The wedding was over. The life he had been living was over. He had spent too long surrounded by people who only wanted what he could give them. But Marcus, Lila, they didn't want his money. They wanted him, or at least the man he could become. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "It's Daniel Harroway," he said when the line picked up. "I need to talk about reopening the plant." There was a pause, then cautiously, "You're joking." "No," Daniel said. "I'm not." That evening he sat in his empty penthouse, the city lights stretching out below him like a kingdom he no longer wanted. The ring he had meant to give his fiancée sat on the table, catching the light. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. It was flawless, just like his life had been, just like he had tried to be. But flawless things were cold, unfeeling, untouchable. He thought of Lila's small hand in his, of Marcus's exhausted eyes, of the names in that envelope, each one a life he had dismissed. He stood, walking to the balcony. The wind was sharp, biting, but he barely felt it. He had spent his life believing he was above everyone else, but he wasn't. He was just a man who had made mistakes, a man who had hurt people, a man who, for the first time, wanted to be better. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text. "I'm coming back tomorrow, and I'm bringing the papers to sign over the first round of funding." Then he waited. Somewhere out there, a little girl was fighting for her life. A father was waiting to see if Daniel would keep his word, and a city was holding its breath, wondering if the monster had finally found his conscience. Daniel took a deep breath. He was ready to find out. The Detroit plant's grand reopening was nothing like the polished corporate events Daniel had hosted in the past. There were no champagne flutes, no politicians posing for photos, no carefully curated speeches about economic growth and market opportunities. Instead, there were people, real people, standing in the same space where they had once been told they were no longer needed. Their faces were a mix of skepticism, hope, and something deeper, something Daniel had spent his life ignoring, trust that had been broken, but was willing to be rebuilt. Daniel stood at the front of the crowd, his hands gripping the podium. He had spent the last month in meetings with lawyers, bankers, and former employees, signing documents, reinstating benefits, and, most importantly, listening. For the first time in his life, he had listened. To the stories of the people he had fired. To the fears of the families who had struggled. To the quiet, stubborn hope of those who had refused to give up, even when the world told them they were forgotten. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady but raw. "That's not something I've said often in my life, but I was wrong. I put profits over people, I chose power over compassion, and I hurt you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I can't undo what I did. I can't bring back the jobs I took away or the security I destroyed. But I can promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The crowd was silent. Daniel could see the doubt in their eyes. He had spent years being the villain in their stories. He couldn't expect them to forgive him overnight, but he could earn it. Behind him, the machinery hummed to life, the sound filling the vast space like a heartbeat. The plant was running again. Not because of a corporate merger or a stockholder's demand, but because a man had finally looked in the mirror and decided he couldn't live with what he saw. Lila was in the front row, her small frame wrapped in a thick sweater, her cheeks flushed with health instead of fever. The treatments were working. The doctors had called it a miracle, but Daniel knew the truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was time. Time he had almost wasted. Time he had been given to change. She grinned up at him as he stepped down from the podium, her eyes bright. "You did it," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You really did it." Daniel crouched beside her, his throat tight. "No, we did it," he corrected. "You're the one who believed in me when no one else did." Marcus stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, but there was something softer in his expression now. "Don't get used to me thanking you," he said, but the gruffness in his voice was undercut by the way his eyes shone. "Buriku, thank you." Daniel nodded. He didn't need gratitude. He needed this, the sound of laughter in a place that had once been silent, the sight of families hugging, the knowledge that he had finally done something that mattered. Later that evening, Daniel stood in the empty church where his wedding was supposed to have taken place. The pews were still bare, the altar still undecorated, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a beginning. He pulled out the medallion, Lila's mother's medallion, and turned it over in his hands. Love is the only thing that lasts. He had spent his life chasing everything but love, wealth, power, control. and it had left him standing alone in a church wondering why no one had come. But now he had something else, a purpose, a chance to be better, a family, not by blood, but by choice. He thought of the names in that envelope, the faces he had finally seen, the lives he had finally valued. He thought of Lila's small hand in his, of Marcus's reluctant trust, of the workers who had shown up today, not because they had to, but because they were willing to give him a second chance. He had spent his life believing he was above everyone else, but he had been wrong. He wasn't above anyone. He was with them. And that was the first true wealth he had ever known. The next morning, Daniel walked into his office for the last time. The skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city he had once ruled now just a backdrop to something far more important. His assistant looked up, surprised. "Sir, the board is still waiting for your statement about the—" "Tell them I'm not coming back," Daniel said, placing a sealed envelope on her desk. "I'm done." She stared at him, stunned. "Done? But your empire was built on the wrong things," he finished. "I'm starting over." He walked out before she could argue, the doors closing behind him with a quiet finality. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the middle of the newly reopened community center, a place he had funded not for publicity, but because it was needed. The walls were lined with photos of the families who had been affected by the plant's closure, their stories now part of something bigger. A woman he had once fired approached him, her eyes wet. "My husband got his job back," she said, her voice trembling. "We can finally pay for our son's college." Daniel smiled. "That's what matters." Lila ran up to him, her laughter filling the room. "You're slow," she teased, grabbing his hand. "Race you to the playground." Daniel let her pull him forward, the weight of his past no longer a chain around his neck, but a reminder of how far he had come. Years later, when people asked Daniel Harroway what had changed him, he would always give the same answer. "A little girl who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, a father who taught me what it meant to be a man, and a church that showed me what it felt like to be truly alone." He had spent the first half of his life chasing power. He spent the second half chasing redemption. And in the end, he found something he had never expected. He found home. What about you? Have you ever had a moment that changed everything? A moment that made you question who you were and who you wanted to be? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about the moments that define us.